Chapter 15. Hello, Paul. Paul swung round. Ricky Wormtorter was leaning against the pointy end of a small board drawn up on the beach. In his right hand he held a long, slim sword that glittered blue in the uncertain light. With his left he was raising a cigar to his lips. "Not terribly good for you, apparently," he went on, having blown a stream of blue smoke out through his nose. "But I thought in the circumstances, what the hell?" "You used to smoke them in bed," Vicky put in over Paul's shoulder. "That's so revolting." Ricky frowned. "Clint Eastwood does it," he said, "and he's a hero." Vicky's eyes flickered upwards just for a second. "Of course, there's no hurry," she said. "Time has no meaning here, blah-de-blah-de. It's just that if I'm around Ricky for more than 3 minutes, I tend to throw up. So if we could get to the sword fighting." With a frown, Ricky straightened up. Maybe it was a trick of the light or the terrain, but he'd never looked taller, broader, more intimidating, or, as he did stylish little backflips with the living sword, more annoying. He had the languid grace of a panther, and his hair was perfect. Paul, on the other hand, just a moment," he said, and glanced around for his other self, who wasn't there. Ricky, Vicky and Sophie, all present, also holding the swirly brown sword, himself, but not in duplicate. Someone had blundered. "Just you and me," Ricky said. He sounded bored, as though he was playing himself in repertory, his 100th Wednesday matinee. "Let's finish this," he added inevitably. "Excuse me." 3 of them looked round and stared at the 4th. Sophie, who was scowling. "Excuse me," she repeated, "but nobody's finishing anything till someone's told me exactly what it is I'm supposed to do. Only, apparently, I'm essential to all this crap, and I've got this sick feeling that this is the moment my whole life's been leading up to. But nobody's had the simple good manners to tell me." "Nothing," Vicky snapped. "You don't have to do anything. Just shut your face, stay still, and don't interfere. Just being here's enough. That's all." "Oh, really?" Sophie seemed less than convinced. "And I should believe you the enemy, right?"
"She's telling the truth, actually," Ricky put in. "All that's needed is for the 2 halves of the sword to be present at the same time, and that sets the magic going."
"That's it." Sophie sounded almost disappointed. "So I could be reading a book or doing the crossword."
Ricky nodded. "Sure," he said. "It's totally straightforward. All it takes is for the guy to have the sword and the girl to be there, in a direct line of sight. And she's got to be in love with him, of course, but..."
Sophie protested loudly. Vicky yelped and threw a piece of seaweed, but missed. Ricky, smirking, did a triple over the wrist backflip and rounded it off with a little flourish. The other Paul still wasn't there.
"Let's start," Ricky said.
No, but Paul got no further. The sword in his hand was tugging at his fingers, like a small child who's just sighted chocolate. He wanted to stay exactly where he was, wait a bit, give his alter ego a bit more time to show up, but apparently he didn't have that option. Unfortunate. He heard Sophie behind him insisting, "I am not!" And then his left foot plunged forward, his right foot slid across, and he was advancing, purposeful, menacing, and for some obscure reason, sideways, like Tyson reincarnated as a crab. Ricky was doing much the same sort of thing, though ever so much more convincingly. "Sorry," he muttered, and then he darted forward and swung his sword from the shoulder, his arm shooting out like a hinged flail. Whatever happened next, Paul was rather foggy about it, partly because he had his eyes shut a lot of the time, and it seemed to go on for absolutely ages. As Paul dragged along behind the sword as it lunged, cut, parried, riposted, counter-thrust, he felt a bit like a small, frail policeman trying to arrest a huge, drunk marine in the middle of a fight. Luckily, nothing he did seemed to matter in the slightest. The sword knew exactly what it wanted to do, and seemed to regard him as an annoying but trivial handicap. It was bewildering, humiliating, exhausting and scary, and the closest thing to it, in his narrow range of experiences, was using windows for the first time. Not for one moment, however, did Paul have the slightest doubt as to how it was going to end. Magic sword or no magic sword, sooner or later. He tried to think back and remember the last time, the time before that, whether dying had hurt very much. Part of him still hadn't given up hope yet. Mr. Dow's voice in the back of his mind. Death has no jurisdiction. The rest of him could point out to their shared heart's content that had obviously been a reference to the other Paul, the one he'd let in through the door in Benny Shumway's office, the one he'd planned to bring along here so that Ricky could kill him, only that had gone wrong somehow. He tried consoling himself with the thought that at least one of him was probably going to make it, and that in that case it was all as broad as it was long, surely. The trouble was, though, that he knew himself too well to be able to lie to himself convincingly. But it didn't matter. Not now, and for all he knew, he might turn out to be a born bridge player, or a very good indeed at basket weaving, assuming Mr. Dow forgave him and let him join in after all. In the middle of all this, he heard someone talking to him. He was rather surprised to discover it was Ricky Wormtorter. "This isn't working," Ricky was saying. Excuse me?" Paul panted, as his sword passed within a millimetre of Ricky's jugular vein. "Not bloody working," Ricky gasped back. "Too evenly matched, cancelling each other." Ricky lunged. Paul sidestepped and hacked at his collarbone as he sailed past. Ricky's sword somehow got there in time to parry. "Out. Completely screwed. We'll be doing this forever and ever. Really, ever and ever. Don't you understand?" Why start now?" Paul replied, but wretchedly he could see what Ricky was driving at. It was the swords' fault. They seemed to have forgotten all about the poor miserable life forms dangling off their hilts as they worked out 1,300 years of pent-up frustration. The fight had subtly changed in the last few seconds. The swords weren't trying to cut flesh anymore. They weren't aiming themselves at Ricky's head or Paul's guts. Instead, they were slamming into each other, edge to edge, flat to flat, in a series of savage parries, each sword trying to batter the other one to death. Only Paul intuitively recognised that was a mug's game, because neither of them was capable of being broken or even scratched. An internal review board inside Paul's head delivered its minority report. "This is silly." But nobody who mattered wanted to know. Vicky had been right after all. A fight to the undeath. Give him Mr. Dow and infinite nothingness any day. "Ricky," he muttered. "What? Think of something. What? You're the fucking professional. Think of something." Ricky shook his head. "I can't," he said. "Mind's a blank. Sorry. What about you?" A shower of sparks fell across Paul's cheek. They stung. "Nothing," he replied. I think we're stuck like it, just like my mum used to warn me." "Sylvan Spee," Ricky grunted, as the feedback from a particularly violent clash vibrated right down Paul's arm into his elbow. "He might be able to do something, but he wouldn't. He must be laughing like a drain right now." "Why?" Paul said, as a sword slammed itself against the other sword's cutting edge and bounced off like a squash ball. I thought... "We're here, stuck in the bloody past. He's back home in our time, and nobody's ever coming back to sort him out, because we'll be here forever. He's won." Ricky pulled a horrible face, his clean, sharp, aftershave commercial features contorted into something both inhuman and surprisingly ordinary. "You have no idea how much I hate him, the bastard. It's all been his fault, right from the..." Paul wasn't listening, because he understood. It had all dropped into place, like the last bit of the jigsaw, which you thought all along was a bit of left-hand sky, but when you turn it over you realise it's the last chunk of right-hand sea, or the sky tricksily reflected in the surface of the pond. Well, all was an exaggeration, but he understood a lot of it, even including Odumla, the great cow of heaven. Annoyingly, there simply wasn't time to digest most of it. He could see it all, like a view from a tower, but he only had a microsecond or so, the fragment of time while the sword was recoiling sideways after a savage but fruitless hack, so he concentrated on the most relevant bit. Of course the fight could end. Ricky was being dim, or deliberately not taking the point. It just needed... "Ricky," he said. "What? Do you trust me?" A great leap of faith on the part of both of them. The swords belted each other, bounced, and sparks flew. Paul's elbow hurt like buggery. "Yes," Ricky said. "Yes, I actually do. You and about 2 other people, and one of them's dead." "Great," Paul said. "Now listen, next time the swords bash into each other, well, not the next time, because they were at it again, pounding into each other like 2 seas meeting. The time after that. The next time," Paul repeated, "let go, all right?" "What?" Another opportunity missed. This time Ricky's sword tried to chop off the crosspiece from Paul's hilt. No dice. Boing. Just let go of the fucking sword, all right, and I'll do the same. If we aren't holding them, they can't fight. Or if they can, we can leave them to it and go home. Looks like they don't really need us anyway. Crash, bounce, sparks. You sure that'll work? Ricky, a 1,300-year-old professional dragon slayer and lieutenant colonel of the Riders of Rohan, asking him if he thought it would work. That was the funniest thing yet. Yes, Paul said, and then he repeated, oh, trust me, okay? Okay, honestly. A glittering curve slicing through air as the sword Skofnung and the sword Turfing raced towards each other, edge to edge. 3! Paul shrieked and let go. In that moment, there was a great deal he wanted to say. He wanted to apologise to Sophie for leaving her, now that it was pretty well settled that she loved him too, without filter, without outside interference, possibly because of the sword and 13 centuries of carefully seeded destiny in Custard space and related dog shit, but completely and forever. And to Ricky, of course, because when he'd said, "Do you trust me?" he'd been plotting Ricky's death, cold-blooded and calculating as any accountant figuring out how to reduce a tax bill, and possibly to a wide selection of other people whom he'd generally let down, disappointed, not done the right thing by. His mother, Uncle Ken, possibly Mr. Tanner's mum, though that was pushing it a bit. And to himself, of course, because he'd just thrown away his life in a chaotic gesture, only for the sake of fixing some fuck-up in the space-time continuum that he couldn't even understand. Chaotic? Absolutely the right word for it. Chaotic is 2 short blanks. Meanwhile, Ricky's sword slipped through Ricky's suddenly relaxed fingers and flew through the air towards Paul, who watched it come at him. At the same time, Paul watched his own sword hurtling straight at the little hollow where Ricky's neck snuggled down onto the collarbone. For some reason, Newton or Einstein would know why, possibly also Galileo, Skofnung got there first, winning the race by a nanosecond, and Paul watched the needle-sharp steel disappear into Ricky's throat just south of his Adam's apple. So, did that mean Skofnung had won the fight? And if so, what implications would that have for the Canadian banking industry? Fuck, Paul thought. I can't remember which way around. And then he remembered. That thing he'd forgotten about where the dying hurts. Yes, but not for very long. "You," said Mr. Dow, "have got a fucking nerve." Paul grinned feebly into the darkness. "Not anymore," he tried to say, but it came out in italics, without the quotation marks. Not that I was ever a great fan of the central nervous system. Pain, for one thing. Hell of a lot of grief just to tell you not to do something. A little flashing light will do just as well. And no, Mr. Dow wasn't amused. Mr. Dow also wasn't there. Paul couldn't see his broad, calm face or hear his deep, refined voice. Instead, the words passed through Paul's mind out of nowhere, going nowhere. "I thought I told you," Mr. Dow said. "Don't you ever come back. But here you are." "Yes." "Marvellous. And this time." A deep sigh, and because Paul couldn't hear it or see the accompanying facial expression, it was somehow even more poignant, pure grief and frustration and annoyance without the ice cubes and slice of lemon. "What did I tell you? I said death has no jurisdiction over you." "Ah, well, everybody makes mistakes." "Not me, that's the whole point. Infallible. Me and taxes." "Actually, that's inevitable, not infallible." "Infallible." Mr. Dow clicked his tongue. "Until now. So," he added grimly, "here we are again, only this time." "I know, and I'll come quickly. You better show me where I'm supposed to sit and what it is you actually do. Presumably you've got to sort to poke one bit of stick in and out of the other bits." "What?" "Basket weaving. And isn't there some tool called a wrapping iron? Is that for patting down the bits of sticks so they lie straight?" "Basket weaving." "That's right, and contract bridge, and conversational Spanish. I'm all ready, and I'll promise I'll join in and not stand about sulking like I used to at the other kids' birthday parties. I know it's for keeps this time, because the only way we could end the duel is if we both died. There wasn't any choice." A nasty thought struck Paul. Highly unlikely, but you never knew. "Ricky is here, isn't he? He did die?" "Worm tota." Mr. Dow laughed icily. "Oh, he's here, all right. Beat you down here by 50,000th of a second. I can only put it down to his instinctive, competitive streak. Always got to win at everything. But you." "Born loser," Paul said. "Always have been. I remember one sports day, the teacher saying, 'You aren't dead.'" Time had no meaning there, so it must have just felt like a very long, awkward silence. Excuse me? You aren't dead. No basket weaving for you, sunshine. Like I keep telling you, but will you bloody listen? Over you, death has no jurisdiction. Mr. Dowell sighed again, raw emotion, unbearably bitter and sad. Either of you, he added. You what? Only this time Paul could hear himself saying it. You what? I mean, Mr. Dowell replied, suddenly visible. One of you's not enough. Oh no. Now I've got two of you cluttering up the place, unsettling the other guests, monopolizing my time, which has no meaning here when there's 1,000,001 things I ought to be doing. Over there, look. Mr. Dowell nodded into the surrounding darkness, just sitting there like an overgrown doorstop, sulking. Paul peered, but gnawed eyes. Where? I can't see him. What? Are you blind as well as annoying? Over there, talking to Theo Van Spee. What? Paul thought. What did you just say? Theo Van Spee. Mr. Dowell repeated. He showed up a second or so after you two. You three, he added wretchedly, though of course in real time that was 30-odd years earlier, but screw the details, death's too short. Not the time, Paul felt, to go wandering off the point. Professor Van Spee is dead? Oh yes. Mr. Dowell laughed grimly, quite definitively, after what that Frank Leartides did to him. Thunderbolt, he added casually, right on the spot too. Zap, da, and a bit of burning spell. No, he won't be going anywhere, ever again. Oh, Paul felt a shudder running up his spine. Well, I suppose he had it coming too right. Custard space won't help him now. Not that Frank wasn't doing him a favour, in a sense, because at least it was very, very quick. I'd fated to have been in Van Spee's shoes when the Canadians caught up with him. Paul looked in the general direction where he thought Mr. Dowell had been pointing, but he couldn't see anything. It took him a moment to realise that, of course, that was the point. In the land of the dead, you can't see the dead people, just as you can't see individual raindrops in the ocean. Oh, he said. Anyway, Mr. Dowell was letting bygones go by, though it was clearly costing him an infinity of effort. There you are, all sorted. I expect you'll be wanting to go home now, he added, with the subtlety of a pink elephant. Well, I mean, yes. Yes, please. Paul struggled to find the question he knew he needed to ask, but it was like trying to tickle trout with numb fingers. How do I... Oh, for pity's sake, Mr. Dowell said, and Paul opened his eyes and saw the most beautiful thing he could possibly imagine. It was white. It was sort of rectangular, and it hummed very softly. He got up from the floor, crossed the lino, and opened its door. Inside he found a pint of needled milk, a bit of translucent yellow cheese rind with green bits on it, 2 vintage yoghurts, and a very, very old carrot. Hello, fridge, he said. The fridge didn't say anything back, but it beamed clean white light at him like a smile. Paul backed away and looked around. He was in his kitchen, back at the flat. Through the window he could see the street lamps, parked cars, the sad, dead plane tree installed some time ago by the government with a view to turning Outland into a green and pleasant land. Carefully he opened a cupboard door. To his overwhelming joy, he found washing up liquid, a packet of Daz, some cans of soup, but no shortcut to the existential void. Well, he quoted, I'm back. Bored. Temporal paradoxes or no temporal paradoxes, Paul hadn't been born yesterday. He went back to the fridge and looked at it for a while, waiting for it to make the first move, and then he folded his arms and said, I know you're in there. The fridge made a sort of clanking noise and turned into Mr. Leartides. Hello yourself, he said. His left arm was stuck out at an angle, just as the fridge door had been. He lowered it. Any chance of a cup of tea? Paul shrugged. If you like, he said. I wouldn't have thought that you drank tea. Oh, I don't, Mr. Leartides replied. Actually, I don't drink anything, except to be sociable. However, in human society, the sharing of hot, milky drinks creates a relaxed ambience conducive to better understanding. Bung the kettle on. All right, Paul said. And then you can start at the beginning. Sure, replied Mr. Leartides, if that's what you really... At the beginning, Paul repeated firmly, even if it means the great cow of heaven. Mr. Leartides perched on the edge of the kitchen table. Milk and 2 sugars, he said. You ready? As I'll ever be. Then I'll begin.
In the beginning, said Mr. Laertides, was me. Let me stop you there just for a second, Paul interrupted. Sure, Mr. Laertides replied, sipping the tea that Paul had just handed him and pulling a face. Milk's off, he said. Paul scowled. Whose fault is that? Sorry, Mr. Laertides grinned. Guess I had other things on my mind than being the best fridge I could possibly be, which is understandable but not acceptable. Here, he reached into the top pocket of his jacket and produced a 2-litre plastic carton of milk. Thanks, Paul said, adding some to his own tea. But what you just said, in the beginning was you? That's right, Mr. Laertides said, and pretty dull it was too, waiting around for the others to show up. When you're floating around in the pre-substantial void, playing I Spy doesn't help much either. Something beginning with N. Paul shuddered. Been there, he said. Ah, Mr. Laertides nodded. But that's the void at the end, which is rather different, also very dull, but also rather depressing and sad. The void at the beginning is just, well, boring, really. So I decided to fill it up with stuff. Paul narrowed his eyes. Bang? Big bang, yes, Mr. Laertides said with a chuckle. I suppose it's a childish side of my nature, but I've always had a thing about loud noises, explosions, and so on. So that makes you... I had help, of course, Mr. Laertides continued smoothly, from Altumla, the great cow of heaven. Where she turned up from, I have no idea. But suddenly there she was, big cow eyes going moo. Nice to have on your side, though. Anyhow, that was all pretty straightforward. Now I'd like to fast forward a minute. A few 100 million years, give or take, Mr. Laertides went on. Can't be more precise than that. Time really does fly when you're having fun, which, in my case, consists of delegating responsibility, taking on more of a consultancy role, putting my feet up and managing not to get involved. Let them get on with it, I said to myself. After all, they're only humans. How much damage can they actually manage to do? Silly me. Enter your friend Theo Van Spee. He wasn't calling himself that back then, of course, because name like that would have stuck out like the proverbial sore thumb in primeval Dark Ages. So he said his name was Utgarth Loki, and he was there to do a bit of routine maintenance to the structure of time and space. And since he was wearing overalls and carrying a toolbox and a clipboard, everybody believed him. Of course, it's easy with hindsight, but I wasn't around. In fact, I was fast asleep, and back then, 13 centuries ago, nobody had heard of time travel, or alternative realities, or transdimensional shift. Indeed, they had gods, and if a bloke turns up who looks like a god and acts like a god and starts jacking acro-pops under the sun and unscrewing the stars, you aren't inclined to ask for any ID, not if you're sensible. We know better, you and me. We know Theo Van Spee had gone back in time using his stupid bloody custard space to cheat history by making King Hring, or is it King Hro? I get them muddled up. Win the jewel, and so the Canadians could inherit the earth. Like I just said, I was fast asleep at the time. Actually, that's a bit misleading, because it makes me sound bone idle and uncaring. But you've bumped into the face, so when I tell you I was asleep and dreaming, you'll know that I was hard at it, busy, creating new worlds, new civilizations, populating them with truly unpleasant people like the late Countess Trudy de Castelbianco, boldly zizzing where no man had zizzed before. Not a good thing in retrospect, but then quite a lot of what I've done over the years has turned out to be good ideas at the time. Anyhow, the first I knew about Theo Van Spee's scam was when I woke up, and I'm not a morning person. I freely admit that, in my office at 70 St Mary Axe, in the guise of Frank Laertides. I hate it when that happens. I only exist, you see, where I'm needed. Sort of goes with the territory. It cuts out a lot of the hanging around in between jobs, but it means you have to get into the habit of hitting the ground running. Anyhow, I woke up, and as soon as I opened my eyes, I knew there had to have been a major fuck-up somewhere, and somewhen in the vicinity, because otherwise why would I be there? That was just over 30 years ago, and Theo Van Spee had just activated Custard Space for the first time. Unfortunately, by the time I kicked down the door of his office and barged in, it was too late. He wasn't there, and I was just in time to see his stupid portable door thing closing behind him and vanishing. I knew something was badly wrong. I could just feel it in my bones. But at that time, I didn't know exactly what it was, so I couldn't take the appropriate action. I had to go back through history, year by year, event by event, every damn thing from wars and plagues and the election of popes down to minor cart accidents and butterflies flapping their wings in a rainforest, till I figured out what had gone wrong. By then, of course, Theo Vansby had done his worst, and I was screwed. It was up to me to put it all right, but Vansby was safely hidden away in his special secret hiding place in the heart of Custard space, where nobody could get at him, not even me. So I had to go back to the drawing board, so to speak, and figure out a cunning plan, which is where you came in.
Me? Paul objected. But I wasn't even born 30 years ago.
Mr. Leartides grinned. Of course not, he said. It takes time setting these things up. First I had to fix it for your mum to meet your dad. Dinner, flowers, all that sort of thing. Then a whole wedding to arrange. You have no idea how much planning goes into one of those things. In comparison, creating the universe was a piece of cake. Paul breathed in slowly and then out again.
You arranged for me to be born.
Mr. Leartides nodded. That's right, he said. Me and your Uncle Ernie, actually, on the two birds, one stone principle. He needed someone to stop Countess Judy, and I needed someone to bring down Theo Vansby. It stood to reason that anyone called into existence to be used, basically as a weapon, was going to have a pretty sad, confusing and miserable life. So we thought, hey, why make two people unhappy? So we created you.
I see, Paul said. Right.
Don't look at me like that, Mr. Leartides said. I mean, millions of people are born into sad, confusing, miserable lives every day, and they don't have heroic destinies to make sense of it. They've just got to bash on with nobody to blame but themselves. You, on the other hand, have the satisfaction of knowing that the thoroughly shitty time you've been having all these years has served a noble and worthwhile purpose, not to mention the fringe benefits, which I'll come to later.
Why not now?
Paul asked. Later, Mr. Leartides repeated. Otherwise I'll lose my thread. We created you, Mr. Leartides went on, and as you know, Ernie had his own agenda and I had mine. Now, as a rule, creating a human being from the ground up is really difficult, messy, rather dangerous business. No, scratch that. Creating a human being is fatally easy. A couple of careless teenagers can knock one up, so to speak, behind the bike sheds in 5 minutes, or 5 minutes and 9 months. Easy if you're human, but I'm not. I had to do it the other way, because if you do what comes naturally, sure enough you get a human being, but you get one at random, if you follow me. I wanted a specific human being. I wanted you. You're giving me that half-witted stare again. Come on, you should be happier. Finally, after all these years of being a redundant loser on the fringes, suddenly you find out you're practically the chosen one. Hey, screw practically, you are the chosen one because I chose you. I designed you, and since I'm damn good at everything I do, you came out perfect, 100% up to specification. You see, you had to have various essential qualities. You had to be able to do magic. You had to be able to walk in dreams for the Countess Judy thing, you know. You had to be a fearless warrior who'd willingly give his life for the cause of right. I said a fearless warrior, Paul, and that's what you are. You just proved that. You don't have to be any good at sword fighting to be fearless. Anyhow, more than all of that, you had to have just the right combination of personality defects, neuroses, and insecurities to drive you along the path we'd mapped out for you, as precisely as a champion lab rat with a connoisseur's nose for the right cheese. You had to be a complete fuck-up. Not just that, you had to be a fuck-up in exactly the right way, because we needed you like that. We had to put, if you like, the mess in the Messiah. And didn't we do well, your Uncle Ernie and me? Well, it goes without saying we're really proud of you. Well,
I am, anyhow. I think Ern got a bit ticked off with you when you condemned him to death everlasting, but he always was prone to be judgmental. So there you go. If ever you've stared wretchedly into a mirror, and of course you must have done every day of your life, and wondered why, oh why couldn't I have just been a bit less of a total and unmitigated disaster area, well, now you know. Even then, we had to be on our toes every minute of every day while you were growing up. Luckily, we had help. Like Miss Hook, for instance, at your school. She let us hex you into a trance so you'd be staring gormlessly out of the window whenever the rest of the class was learning the really important stuff, the things we couldn't allow you to know. Have you ever wondered about that? Thought you had. You're thick, see, but not that thick. I mean, you couldn't be that thick, or you'd never be able to remember to breathe. Now, at this juncture, I expect you may be feeling just a trifle resentful and upset on the grounds that you've never had a proper life. You've been used and manipulated, and it's just not fair. To which, Paul, all I can say is, yes, you have. Sorry about that, but it's basically an omelette and egg situation. And if it makes you feel any better, you aren't the only one. See, all along, ever since you were born, here's a clue. When is Sophie's birthday? Paul opened his mouth to speak and then hesitated. I don't know, he said. That is, she did tell me once, several times actually, but I keep forgetting, and then she'd get all quiet and hurt about it, and it was obviously not a good subject, so I didn't go there. Mr. Lairtides grinned infuriatingly. You forgot, he said. Actually, you have a better than average memory. It's just I keep punching holes in it. Paul, Sophie was born at the same time, on the same day, in the same year as you were, and that is not a coincidence. So you see, the two of you have something in common. Like, if I was an artist and signed my work, you'd both have the same scrawly writing on the small of your backs. Paul gazed at him for quite some time without speaking. Oh, he said, eventually. Oh, is right, Mr. Lairtides continued. I created her too, or at least I manipulated her, but she already existed because she was the other half of Scoffnung, the living sword. My job was to reincarnate her, for want of a better word, as your counterpart and prospective soulmate, which was bloody rough on her, as I'm sure you can appreciate. In fact, she's probably had an even rougher deal than you have. Just think, being engineered from the moment of reconception to be the only girl in the world for you. Ghastly, or what? But that's by the way. Actually, it's not. It's tangentially relevant, because we did roughly the same with you as we did with her. See, you two were already around when we were setting the project up. Of course you were. You were fighting a duel to the death on Bursa Island with Ricky Wormtoter. We took you and reincarnated. No, I hate that word. We recycled you into Paul Carpenter. And that accounts for something which I know has been buggering the hell out of you for the last few days. Namely, how come Mr. Dahl says that death has no jurisdiction over you? And why did the other Paul Carpenter, who you let in through the door in Benny Shumway's office, suddenly vanish when you reached the island? Second question first. He vanished because, of course, he was already there, had always been there, for the last 13 centuries. Creating you wasn't an act of reproduction so much as duplication. If this was science fiction rather than prosaic fact, I'd call it cloning. I made a copy and sent it to live in your mummy's tummy for 9 months, which is why, you see, you can't die, or at least not for any meaningful length of time, because you've been there, done that, been dead for well over 1,300 years. Oh, stop gawping at me like a brain-damaged goldfish and think about it for a moment. You know the answer already. You just haven't made the connection. Just now, you figured out what should have happened on the Bursa Island duel. King Shor and King Ring killed each other, and everybody else lived happily ever after. But that was 1,900 years ago. Now, that's what should have happened. Now, thanks to you, that's what did happen, and history has been put back on the right track. We have the almighty US dollar, and the almighty Canadian dollar, and that means, yes, you're getting there, slowly but surely, like a snail working for the post office, that means that you've been dead all that time.
One of you, anyway, which means the other of you, the you, can't snuff it, since where you're concerned it has been conclusively snuffed for a very long time, which is what I was banging on about just now when I mentioned fringe benefits. Congratulations, Paul. You can't die. You are an immortal. That was too much.
Fuck you!
Paul yelled. What? Mr. Lairtides actually had the gall to look hurt. Sod it, Paul. I thought you'd be pleased.
Pleased?
Paul could hardly find the words.
You bastard! You just said how really shitty it is being me, and now you tell me I've got to go on being me forever and bloody ever.
Mr. Lairtides laughed. Oh, I see, he said. I get your point. Well, it's not like that. You see, that's the good thing about human beings. One of the good things, anyhow. In point of fact, there's 4 good things about being human, and this one's number 3 on the list. Human beings change, Paul. They don't have to stay the same. You don't have to go on being a pathetic little creep forever and ever if you don't want to. No, really. Trust me on this. You can change. You can gradually grow to be less pathetic. You can mature, grow as a person, get alive. He frowned. By my calculations, it'll be your 3rd, but we don't begrudge it to you. The neighbour is worthy of his hire and all that. Anyway, Mr. Lairtides said, there we are. We'd created you, and Sophie as well, and programmed you, wound you up like a couple of clockwork mice, ready to be turned loose to do your bit in the struggle against chaos and Theo Van Spee. Everything was set up nicely. The time was right, everything poised like a coiled spring and tickety-boo. Just one last detail remaining. Before I could get any further with fighting Theo, I had to find him first, an essential ingredient, I hope you will agree. But not easy. You managed it, of course. You showed me the way, as I knew you would. You flushed out Theo's extra secret hiding space in Custard space. But it took a long time, and it was touch and go at times. Ricky Wormtoter nearly screwed us at one point as well, when he tricked you into poisoning him so that he could escape to Custard space, and then very nearly got Sophie to drink the filter and fall in love with him, in which case he'd have had the other half of your sword, and the whole deal would have been off. But we got there in the end, thanks to a lot of good luck and good judgment, and thanks to me, mostly. Come on, I deserve some of the credit, after all those centuries of unremitting hard slog. How can I explain this? All right. Think of a computer screen, and somewhere on it there's an icon you can click on to open the program you need. Only it's hidden. It's under something or disguised as something, and you can't find it. So all you can do is go over the screen millimetre by millimetre, clicking on everything until at last you get lucky and there it is. That's you, Paul. You were my mouse, and all that really bizarre crap I had you doing, going to weird places and doing really stupid things, buying toothbrushes and standing under trees, well, let's just call it camouflage. What I really needed was for you to be in certain places at certain times, going click to see what would happen. Eventually, by trial and error. Oh, by the way, did you really think that all that sticking your finger on blown-up photographs was actually prospecting for bauxite? Oh, really? Good, you're slow on the uptake. No, you were scrying all right, but not for bauxite. For custard. Anyhow, by trial and error, I narrowed it down to the right place and time, and then I sent you there with Sophie, because she had to be there too, to set off the program, as it were. Unfortunately, you two contrived to piss each other off. A hint for you, Paul. Never, ever laugh at a girl who's wound her own hair into a forkful of spaghetti because, well, it's a female thing, and we all know how unbelievably alien and strange their mindset is. But they just don't like it, okay? You contrived to piss her off just when the search was coming together nicely, and by some ghastly fluke of really bad luck, when I sent you back to have another try, who did you pick to take with you? Put the other half of the enemy's living sword, namely bloody Vicky. And that was where things started to get a bit screwed. It was a bit, Paul decided, like being a sock inside a tumble dryer.
All around him the world, his whole life, everything he'd ever assumed or thought he knew, was swirling, spinning, not to mention chucking him about and bashing him into things. He was immortal. He was 1,300 years old, or he'd been alive 13 centuries ago. He wasn't quite sure which. It'd been designed and built, like a barn conversion, to serve some grand design, except that its grandeur consisted of putting right a cock-up caused by a dirty little financial scam. Not just him, but Sophie too. And the worst part of it, no, not in the least the worst part, but beyond all question the part that hurt him the most, was that Sophie... Mr. Laretides was still blathering on, but Paul tuned out, struggling to build up the scattered Lego bricks of fact into a coherent structure. Sophie was the other half of this stupid sword, so she'd been around 13 centuries ago too, but it was necessary for the stupid grand design for her to be Paul's, his whatever, because he couldn't bring himself to drag even the word for what he felt for her into this disgusting mess. And so she'd been dragged through time, reborn, remodelled, made over like a Victorian end of terrace on the Isle of Dogs, so that he'd have no choice but to love her, and she'd have no choice but to love him back. No choice. And when he thought about how messed up he'd been over her drinking the stupid filter, because then it could never be the real thing. If anything ever merited the term obscene, this had to be it. Paul jumped up, and with a degree of speed and agility that it conspicuously lacked when he was dangling off the hilt of the stupid magic sword, he reached out and clamped both his hands round Mr. Laretide's throat. As I was saying, Miss Laretides went on, and Paul felt his fingertips meeting thin air, that was saying things started to get a bit screwed. Would you mind not doing that, by the way? It doesn't bother me in the least, but if you go on like that, you'll hurt yourself. See, I told you. Right, now you're sprawling comfortably. I'll continue. It was just as well that I'd taken the precaution of dosing you with the anti-falling-in-love stuff, because otherwise you'd have gone to the pictures with Vicky, and you'd have been Cupid's pincushion while they were still showing the trailers. But my foresight and attention to detail won the day. I've already told you that doesn't work, and don't blame me if you sprain your wrist trying. And we got away with it. Bit of a blow for Vicky, of course. Actually, she's a nice kid for half a sword. It was a mean trick our Ricky played on her, using Countess Judy's secret Jedi mind techniques to wash out her memory. But turning on the old worm-toted charm and nagging her into marrying him. Clever, though, because Ricky, well, he knows as well as anybody that no woman on earth would be married to him for more than a week without ending up hating him beyond all measure. And if she hated him, then he could never have both halves of Turving, his magic sword, and then that'd be a key ingredient missing, and so it'd be impossible to recreate the Bursa Island jewel. Neat, only Ricky overreached himself, got careless. It was his feud with Countess Judy, you see. When you got rid of her, it broke the spell that Ricky had put on Vicky. Straight away she was able to figure out what he had done, and the net effect of all his ingenuity was to get so mad at him that she was determined that duel was going to happen. Be her way of getting even with him, you see. So, although none of us realized at the time, Vicky was actually on our side all along. When Ricky realized that, of course, he freaked out completely, which was why he had to try his last and wildest shot, getting you to kill him with the poisoned custard slice. It wasn't real poison, of course. It was custard laced with 1/2 ounce of Vansby's crystals, the effect of which was to zap him across the interdimensional debris like a rat up a conduit. Theo helped him, of course. He arranged for the crystals to be put into the custard slice. That was dead clever, actually, but I'm getting ahead of the story. You are? Paul said. Yes, Mr. Laretides replied, as Paul tried without success to smash in his head with the heel of his left shoe. Before we deal with that, let's go back to the night when you came reeling home from the pub, pissed as a battalion of nudes, remember? I was not, you bloody were. You fell over in the kitchen. That, Paul pointed out, was only because all the fuses had blown. You did that, presumably. Mr. Laretides shook his head. Not guilty, he said. That was Theo Vansby. He'd found out somehow or other that I'd been standing guard over you all along in my aspect or avatar as your fridge. You were getting awkwardly close to becoming a nuisance, but he couldn't attack you at work because I was there all the time, so it'd have to be at home, where he could neutralize me without being too obvious about it. So he sent a freak power surge down the electric mains and tried to fry me. Nearly worked, too. I rarely thought I'd had it that time, which was why I tried, with what I reckon just might be my dying breath, to explain things to you, the whole deal, Utgarth Loki and the great cow. Only, he said reproachfully, you fell asleep. And then I found I wasn't mortally wounded after all, but I wasn't going to hang about and let Theo have another crack at me, so I tidied the place up a bit and went away. That's why, you may remember, when you woke up there was a brand new fridge, Snoozy no less, and it had fresh milk and eggs and bacon and stuff in it, instead of all the decaying grunge I had to put up with.
Fine, Paul said after a while. So, we've covered that bit. Get back to when I killed Ricky with the poisoned cake?
Well,
said Mr. Laertides, apparently completely unfazed by Paul's fruitless efforts to poke his eyes out with a broken biro.
It was really very clever. The custard slice, you see, wasn't poisoned when it left the sandwich bar place. It was perfectly good custard slice. I know that because I gave it to you myself. What, you hadn't worked out that one for yourself? All those identical little bold round-headed guys with obscure-sounding names, Mr. Paleologus and Mr. Porphyrogenitus and what have you. They were all me, of course. What else do you think they were? I gave it to you myself in order to make sure you'd overdose on custard and fall through into custard space so you could sniff out Theo's secret lair. But when Ricky bumped into you on the corridor, spilt your coffee, if you recall, all down your front, well, while you were mopping the coffee off yourself and generally fussing about and not paying attention, he quietly sneaked a massive dose of crystals into the custard slice, which he then proceeded to beg of you and eat. Now, believe me, I hold no brief for the guy. He was rather an annoying, pompous little toad most of the time, but you've got to concede he was resourceful, and he was cool under pressure. He slid neatly out of the wreck of the let's assassinate me and then you scenario, and straight into this plan B, where he escapes to custard space and frames you for his murder. Extra cunning, of course, because he had a fair idea that Colin the Goblin, remember him, as soon as Colin the Goblin found out that Tanner had you under armed goblin guard in the strong room, pending execution for murder, he'd realise that he had to rescue you, or else lose out on any chance of getting his sticky claws on your stash of crystals. And, of course, he knew all about that unfortunate business whereby Colin the Goblin and Sophie got linked up. Perfect as far as he was concerned, because it solved his biggest problem, how to get Sophie into custard space too, so that he could dose her with the filter, and so neutralise your magic sword and thereby prevent the Berser Island rematch. Simple. Colin gets you through, then goes back to collect crystals so that both of you could escape from custard space. But as soon as Colin goes back, Sophie comes through. Bang, all set. Everybody exactly where he wanted them to be. Clever boy, that Ricky. Shame he never amounted to anything in the end.
He's dead then, Paul said.
What? Ricky?
Mr. Laertides nodded enthusiastically.
Oh, yes, you betcha. And not just dead, but really dead. Right now, said Mr. Laertides, consulting his watch, he'll have finished an aerobics class and be just about to start his third session of conversational Esperanto. He grinned. Let you in on a little secret, he added. Your mate, Mr. Dow, doesn't like Ricky very much.
I'm sorry, Paul said after a moment. I'm sorry he's dead. I thought I liked him a bit. I thought he was on my side some of the time.
Oh, he was, Mr. Laertides said, just so long as you were being useful. Like in the Countess Judy business, he was on your side then when it suited him, and he probably decided he liked you, because it'd be more convenient that way. But first and foremost, he was what he was. You don't get to be management in a firm like J.W. if you aren't what Ricky was.
Oh? Paul said. And what would that be?
Totally and unalterably self-centred, Mr. Laertides replied. Like me, for instance, all I've ever cared about from the moment I woke up 30 years ago was getting the job done, nailing Theo, getting history back together again. As a result, I caused you all this grief, and Sophie and everybody else who had the bad luck to get sucked into the mess. Or like Theo Vansby. Sure, he wasn't in it for the money, like Tanner or Humph Wells. He was more your sort of Werner von Braun type. He went somewhere he could carry on his work and screw loyalties and principles, and of course other people. And Ricky, of course, all he cared about was keeping clear of me. That, he added with a sweet smile, and money. He liked money a lot.
Oh, Paul said. I'm still sorry, though. I killed him. Mr. Laertides frowned. He killed you, though. Twice. So what? I shouldn't have done it. Only I had to, but that doesn't make it right. Mr. Laertides looked at him for an uncomfortably long time. You know, he said eventually, when I designed you for this operation, I did a bloody good job, for which, he added, for what little it's worth, I apologise most sincerely. I had to do it, though, same as you, but that didn't make it right. Paul was silent for a while, and then he shrugged. Forget it, he said. I'd probably have turned out a complete mess even if you hadn't. Oh, for crying out loud, Mr. Laertides said. Anyhow, Mr. Laertides went on, it's all about the long and the short of it, not the most edifying or uplifting of tales, I grant you. It would have been far better if Theo Van Speer had been some kind of dark lord hell-bent on ruling the world, rather than just an obsessive academic with rather twisted priorities. And it would have been far more satisfying for you if he'd been on a quest, battled the enemy to a standstill, and chucked a ring down a crack in a volcano instead of basically just doing as you were told, once you'd finally managed to figure out what it was you were supposed to be doing. But it wasn't like that, I'm afraid. Theo doesn't fit the mould, for one thing. He was never cut out for dark lordery, mainly because, well, in this context, dark is usually just another way of saying not very bright. You've got to be as thick as a whole timber yard of short planks to try that kind of gig, and whatever else Theo was, he wasn't that. And you... He's dead too, then, Paul interrupted. Mr. Laertides grinned. Yes, he said. You can take my word for that. I won't nauseate you with the details. Thank you, Paul said. I don't tell me. Mr. Laertides groaned. You feel guilty about that as well. But Paul just shrugged. He was someone I knew. It's always unsettling when someone you know dies. It feels odd, like the engine's been taken to pieces and put back together again. Only a bit's been left out and it doesn't quite run right. But guilty, he added. No, well, not really. Actually, I'd much prefer not to have to think about it at all. Good idea, said Mr. Laertides. There's a whole lot of stuff in this life that's not nearly as big a pain in the bum as it could be, just so long as you don't think about it. It's there, of course, but if you made a point of fixating on every damn thing that's wrong or bad or unfair in this universe, you'd come to a pretty bad end. You'd turn out all screwed up, bitter and warped and inhuman. Like me, in other words. Not a good idea. Don't go there. But I was just saying, Theo wasn't an evil overlord type, and Ricky wasn't either. He was more your basic resourceful idiot. And then that just leaves you, the hero. And the bit that nobody's ever got right, not in 50,000 years of storytelling, is what to do with the hero once the story's over. Oh, there's a happily ever after, but you're not a fool. You don't believe in that for 1 minute. And killing off the hero at the end, that's good from a closure point of view. But we've already established, no go in your case, over you death has no jurisdiction. But you were designed, built, raised, and programmed specifically for the purposes of the story. And now it's finished and you're left over at the end, so what do we do with you? Well? Paul asked after a long silence. Well, what? Was that a rhetorical question? Paul asked. Or do you really want suggestions? Oh, I see, Mr. Laertides said, his face relaxing out of a slight frown. You want to be consulted. You want input. Well, why not? Your life, I suppose, or at least it is now, after we've all finished with it. All right then, Paul, what do you want to be when you grow up? Paul thought for a moment. Rid of you, he said. Mr. Laertides raised an eyebrow. Me specifically, or you specifically, for starters, Paul replied. And all the rest of you as well. To put it another way, I'd like for everyone I've come into contact with ever since this whole horrible J.W. Wells thing started to fuck off and leave me in peace. Really? Yes! Mr. Laertides nodded. Okay, he said, and that'd include Sophie, of course. Some moments can take a ridiculously long time. To begin with, Paul had assumed it was just a trick, a word game, and then he'd been about to say, no, of course not Sophie. But then the thought came wriggling into his mind that everything there might or might not be between her and him was a lie, a contrivance, every bit as untrue as if they'd both drunk the stupid bloody filter. In fact, it was worse than the filter, because at least she'd offered to drink it of her own free will, after Countess Judy had wiped the love out of her mind. But of course she'd offered, because her own free will was nothing of the kind.
She'd been set up from birth, just as he had. He couldn't accept love like that, because it was as real and genuine as a £3 note. Sure, he loved her, and probably always would, but it wouldn't be fair on her, wouldn't be right. And the only reason he had these stupid high moral principles, couldn't bring himself to do something that he knew was wrong, was because Mr. Lairtide's seen to it that he'd been made that way. So he took a deep breath and said, "Including Sophie, yes." "Oh." Mr. Lairtides looked at him, shrugged and said, "You don't mean that." "Yes, I do. You know I do." "But that's..." Mr. Lairtides thought hard, hunting through the recesses of his mind for a word apt but unfamiliar. "That's silly," he said. "The two of you go together like, well, adolescence and acne." Paul sighed. He was fed up with this conversation. "I know," he said. "You made us that way, and I want rid of everything you made us be. Can you understand that? Or do you need time for me to draw you a Venn diagram?" "No, it's all right." Mr. Lairtides was frowning. "Fine, if that's what you want," he said. "I can fix it. Sure, no problem." Double take. You can?" "Of course." Mr. Lairtides grinned. "Me, the master of the universe. I can do pretty much anything I like, now that Theo Van Spee's been dealt with." He yawned and glanced at his watch. "What I think you're getting at, though it's hard to be certain since so much of what you say is pure drivel, what I think you're getting at is that you're pissed off at the idea that I made the two of you what you are, because that was necessary for the job in hand. What you'd like, therefore, is to be someone else, for both of you to be someone else, presumably, since you care more about her than about you, which is kind of sweet in a really dozy, half-baked sort of way. Am I right?" "Well," Paul said slowly, yes, yes, I suppose so." "Okay." Mr. Lairtides shrugged cheerfully. "Any particular person you'd like to be, or you're just happy taking pot luck like everybody else? No, of course you don't hold with predestination outside influence, so you'd want it to be totally random. You just want to be, let me guess, somebody normal, yes?" "Sophie and me both," Paul replied. "Yes, you can do that?" "Well, it's hardly rocket science. You're sure?" Sure, or just a bit sure." "Look, just get on with it, will you?" "Fine," Mr. Lairtides said. And then everything was different, and shortly after that, everything was pretty much the same.